Oh, happy birthday. What a better way to spend it. What a better place to spend it than Senate estimates. Okay, welcome back everyone. And I now welcome officers of CASA, and we won't be asking for opening statements. If you've got one, you can table it. Senator Fawcett.
You won't be asking for your age either, Ms Spence. You'll be glad to hear. Thank you. Well, in fact, this does actually take me back a little bit. I'm assuming in your preparation for your role you read through Hansard transcripts for many years, and you'd be aware that between 2014 and 2017, I and your predecessors had many discussions about colour vision deficient pilots. And eventually, as you would be aware, your predecessor, Mr Carmody, in February of 2020 announced to the world, and I'll read here from a statement he sent out, that research, so evidence, in recent years has shown that relying on diagnostic tests alone may be unnecessarily limiting when considering the impact of colour vision deficiency on aviation safety. Advances in technology, operating techniques and human factors training can now mitigate many of the safety risks of colour vision deficiency. The technology to assist pilots has developed significantly, and the impact of colour vision deficiency on aviation safety should take these changes into account. And at the end of his statement he says, CASA has carefully examined all relevant safety issues and believes this new approach, which is the same as New Zealand and the FAA, offers a practical alternative assessment for colour vision deficient pilots. We've listened to the views of pilots and made judgments based on research and evidence, which is a fantastic outcome. They changed the lot of pilots, which had been thrown into confusion by a new senior medical officer within CASA who didn't like Australia's position, which was to allow pilots to do an operational test, and despite losing AAT cases, etc., and reviews of evidence that finally proved we should do this operational test like the New Zealanders and the FAA, it's all happening again. Could you explain why CASA is spending $500,000 on a review, and what is the evidence base to justify this change of position? What incidents have occurred? What evidence has led to the decision to spend $500,000 of taxpayers' money and overturn what has been in the CASAs for some years now to the detriment of a group of individuals in our aviation community?
Well, thanks, Senator. Pip Spence, Director of Aviation Safety at the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. I wouldn't describe it in the same way that you have in terms of, someone coming in and not supporting the previous position. I will ask our Principal Medical Officer if she wouldn't mind joining us at the table, but I think the first thing is really it's a question about what's consistent with the standards versus what's okay from an operational perspective, and I don't think we've changed our position about that there aren't ways of overcoming the issue of colour blindness from an operational perspective. I think there is a different question about whether that is consistent with the standards, and that's a harder question to answer. So I might pass to Dr Manderson to provide a bit more detail, Senator.
Dr Manderson, welcome.
Thank you very much. So regarding the colour vision assessment, what we found a couple of years ago and going back a bit before that was that there was a lot of difficulty and confusion in how that colour vision was being applied by the flight instructors that were assessing the pilots with colour vision deficiency and the pilots themselves in what they would be expecting to be demonstrating in their flights. So we had some difficulties where the forms and the flights were not being conducted consistently to a consistent standard across the board, where someone might have one kind of flight or assessment with one assessor and a completely different one with somebody else, with someone else. So with that degree of confusion and lack of clarity, we realised that having established that an operational flight-based assessment was really important, absolutely, how we did that was where there was a big gap in what we were doing and why we were doing it that led to all of that confusion and some difficulties in what standard was being met by whom and when. So that's why we saw that gap in the how that hadn't been filled by any of those other organisations or jurisdictions. So we've consulted really quite extensively. Even last Friday we had an international meeting here in Canberra with our colleagues from FAA, New Zealand, ICAO, the United States military have come across as well to share their experiences with us and how we do that now. And there really is a global consensus that the approach that we've taken is world leading and will make a big difference to the consistent application of a good standard that our instructors and our pilots can rely on to make a safe decision.
Sure. So I don't have a problem with standardisation. I think that's excellent. I do note my understanding is that New Zealand did have a course to standardise their examiners, which we didn't adopt, even though we adopted their operational test. Am I correct in my understanding of that?
I'm not familiar with the detail of the way the New Zealand team initially applied theirs, but they're certainly very excited about looking at what we're doing and learning from what we're doing, because we've gone to sort of next level, so much more depth, much more comprehensive. And the CAA New Zealand Chief Medical Officer is very interested in learning from what we've done.
Sure. So my understanding is because we didn't have any standardisation initially, the initial batch of flight examiners actually went to New Zealand to get their training there, and in fact we encouraged or enabled, if pilots wished to bear the cost to go to New Zealand to be tested by the New Zealanders, that we would accept that as a valid medical, so from a system that did have standardisation and did the test. So I don't have a problem with standardisation. What I have a problem is, when I look at your website, we have gone back to the days of saying if you pass the operational test, we are still going to limit you in terms of what you can do as a pilot. For example, fly as or with a co-pilot. On what basis, what evidence has been put forward, given everything Mr Carmody said, given everything the AAT found, and cases back in ancient history, 30 years ago now, when Australia became a world leader, what evidence justifies that imposition of a restriction on someone who passes the operational test?
So the evidence is based around the demonstration of being able to do the elements of the flying task that have been assessed by this international group of expert pilots and flying instructors as to what are the time-critical, safety-critical, colour vision-dependent tasks of the flying task. And that was a gap that wasn't there in the work that was done leading up to the New Zealand assessment that we've now been able to produce. So the evidence is around, it's not about the medical diagnosis, it is what it is with the diagnosis of colour vision deficiency, but the evidence is now about being able to know exactly how that medical status affects this person's fitness to fly and fly safely. And that's exactly the same as we do with people with kidney disease or hearing deficiency or heart disease. They don't meet the standard, but now we can in very great detail and very safely, effectively and consistently assess whether or not the way they meet the standard presents a hazard to safe air navigation. And that's the way we do all of our medical assessments.
Sure. So, in theory that is fine, but what you're describing is that your test is now focusing on some discrete task elements that you believe are important. But what your website says is that even if someone passes that test, so has now jumped through these additional hoops of specific tasks, you're still going to put limitations on what they can exercise as captain in command of an aircraft. What is the evidence to justify those limitations? That is my question.
So, Senator, if I can jump in, Andreas Mucheder, I'm the Executive Manager for the Stakeholder and Engagement Division, and the website and some of that information sits in my area. I think what you're describing, if that is correct, is not our policy. So our policy is that there are various conditions that we can put on medical certificates depending on how you go in the test. But if you pass the test and demonstrate that you're operationally safe, there is no condition of a co-pilot. What Dr Manderson is saying, though, is that because you don't meet a medical standard, so you have not met a medical standard that's internationally accepted, but you have proven you are safe, we will grant you a medical certificate. So we can't say that you've met a standard, but we can say you're safe to fly, and those conditions will be applied depending on the way you've gone. So I think if that's on our website, I'll take that up because that's not the policy.
Sure. So 2 points. One, I think it was amply proven almost a decade ago and 2 decades before that that as we dug into the history, those standards emerged from maritime standards that were applied in the United Kingdom in the days of Sopwith camels and things into World War I. And the reason we no longer require them is that we have secondary means of communication. We've demonstrated through a whole range of flight profiles and cockpit modifications, particularly with the advent of EFIS screens, etc., that many of the old colour hierarchies around warnings, etc., are no longer relevant. They're not required to do the task. Even the red and green lights are not required when pilots wear Bluetooth headsets. So I come back to the fact that your website, and at this stage this is what industry is seeing, okay, your website states that a pilot who passes the test will have these restrictions until they have, and I'll just get the figures here, 100 hours of flight at night, so the ATPL standard, or 75 hours of instrument time. And as I've done just a very quick bit of research on the current costing of something like a Cessna 172RG, which is the kind of aircraft for night VFR or instrument flying, the costs between Moorabbin, Dubbo, Adelaide, Sunshine Coast vary from about $250 to $355, excluding GST. So we're putting a burden on pilots who want to into the industry of $30,000 to $40,000, and I'm not aware of any evidence that would justify those restrictions if they have passed the operational test.
I think, Senator, what we're saying, we think our website's wrong, so we will go back to review it because that doesn't sound like our policy. While we've, as Dr. Manderson said, we're working internationally, looking at how we actually manage this issue. But the whole point was, if you pass the test in the simplest terms, then you've got a permission to fly, and those sorts of conditions you've just described should not be applying. So if you can bear with us, we'll review the website because it just doesn't sound right what you've just read out.
I'll have a look tomorrow afternoon. I'll be very pleased to see that gone. My last question then is, my understanding is that in accordance with the regulation, which I could look it up, I've got it written here somewhere, but I'm sure you know what it is. In accordance with the regulation, CASA was still advising pilots to do the operational test, which they did at some cost, and then AVMED were denying them an aircrew medical because CASA had changed its mind, even though the regulation still said it was possible, and even though pilots had been directed to that. And so some pilots now, in excess of 12 months, have forked out thousands of dollars to take a flight test and have had their application refused. What is the situation for people who have previously done it before this change in approach? What is the situation for those who did it in this intervening period where the regulation said they would be approved, they committed to a flight test on that basis, and have now been told they're not able to fly? What is CASA going to do to enable those people to move ahead with their life, and can you guarantee there's going to be no retrospective action against the many pilots who did the original 2020 announced operational flight test, have been flying single pilot in RFDS type operations, multi-pilot in RPT operations, both domestically and overseas, without incident since they got their medicals? Can you guarantee that they will be able to continue to exercise the qualifications that they have earned in accordance with the regulation, or will there be any retrospective action that CASA is looking to impose upon them?
Can I just sort of jump in first? If you've got people who've come to you saying that they haven't been approved, then I would really encourage you to refer them either to myself, to Mr Marcellia or Dr Manderson, because that doesn't sound like that's consistent with our policy. I would have thought with medicals, there are things that come up every 2 years or whatever, depending on where you are, and so there would be no retrospective requirements. But if matters change over time, then to get your medical renewed. But there's certainly not an intention to have a retrospective element to all of this. But again, encourage anyone who's spoken to you who said that they've been refused on the grounds that you've described, please encourage them to talk to us, because that just doesn't sound right.
And my last question, Chair, before you wind me up, is that industry had been told that the new test and all of its conditions would be released in September this year. We're now approaching the end of October. So where are we at, and when will these people have some certainty about their future or current career?
Yeah, so Senator, we have slowed that down just a little bit because we're working through some of those implementation issues that you just mentioned. So, like Ms. Spence said, we don't expect people to automatically have to prove things themselves, but where we've discovered that a test maybe has some uncertainty around it, we might ask somebody to do that test again, and in that circumstance we would fund that. But these are the policies that we haven't yet settled, which is why you haven't seen a policy come out. So they haven't been finalised, but they're very close. So, as Ms. Spence said, we'd very happily follow up any individual case where someone's been disadvantaged, because our understanding was that the existing scheme was in place while we were settling the new one.
And no one had been, as far as my understanding is, no one's been
No one's been
refused.
refused.
No refusals or cancellations for colour vision deficiency.
Okay, I will go back to the email trail that I have been given and see if I can see whether there's substance to what was reflected in that email, and if that's the case, to you, Ms. Spence,
that'd
who's
be
the
great,
best
thanks,
person
Senator.
to...
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Fawcett. Senator Roberts.